Today's webinar, as you all know, is entitled Connecting Policymakers and Educational Researchers. The goal today is to have some time with some policymakers who have had experience working on ed policy or policy in general, and to have them speak to us and share their insights, their experiences, their points of view, to help us as researchers think through really two things. One, how can I think about the area I research, my area of interest, and its connection to policy? So I'm hopeful some of the conversation today will help folks think about that. And the second area, if you will, is to also think through strategies for actually engaging with policymakers, getting their attention, disseminating our work. So I'm hopeful the conversation will have nuggets of information on those two topics. And as it relates to engaging with policymakers, you know, there's all sorts of ways to think about that, including how do we as a community do that? How do we as individuals do that? So I'm certain through our discussion today, we'll touch upon all these things and get some interesting insights. And with that, I'll sort of more formally get things started and welcome you all to this webinar today, sponsored by Division 15 of the American Psychological Association and put together by the Policy Committee of Division 15. And I want to thank Benjamin Brock, who's the chair of that policy committee, who's worked with all members of our committee, and we've all worked together, but through his leadership to put this together, to bring this to Division 15 and other interested members. So today we actually have two panelists. We were hoping for three, but I'm imagining something must have come up. So we do have two wonderful panelists who are with us live today. We have a third who will be sharing, who wasn't able to make it today, or a fourth, I guess, but is sharing some of her experiences and insights in other ways. We have some materials that we'll share with you all in that regard. So with that in mind, the format of this webinar will be very informal conversation. I'm going to serve as moderator. I'm Sharon. I'm Sharon Nichols. I'm a member of the policy committee for the Division 15 and been elected to serve as moderator today. So as moderator, I'm going to have we have a set of questions that the committee put together that we thought would be good to invite conversation regarding a range of issues related to ed research and ed policy. I'm going to go ahead and ask these questions, and we'll ask each panelist to weigh in, give their thoughts and their experiences and insights. Please feel free as an audience member to put your questions in the chat as we go. You can wait to the end, but please feel free to put them in as we go. If it makes sense, we might, you know, interrupt and bring that question to the forefront. Really want this to be conversational in nature and informal in nature as well. So with that in mind, the first question I have, we'll have our panelists introducing themselves. So rather than me doing the introductions, I'll let them introduce themselves. So the first question is, you know, introduce yourself. And as you introduce yourself, just describe your current and or past education policymaking or policymaking roles that you have now or have had in the past that you bring to this discussion. And Jason, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Great, thank you very much. And thank you all for having me. My name is Jason Broder. I'm currently a state senator in the state of Florida. In Senate District 9. Florida has 40 senators and 22 million people. So I have about 550,000 constituents. I've been in the Senate only recently, but spent 8 years in the Florida House of Representatives, where I did policy for the last 10 years or so on mostly K through 12, some higher ed, but really moving Florida. In 1999, we were ranked 44th in educational outcomes by Education Week. And the year I left the House, we were ranked 4th. So we moved up 40 spots of the 51 districts that are measured, because we include the District of Columbia in there. plus the states, and have done a lot of policy making at the state level for the third most populous state. My colleague here on the panel is in the first most populous state, so a lot of big state experience from the policy standpoint. I am a product of public schools here in Florida. So I went to school here when we were 44th or worse, and have seen the potential for improvement. I have since, I was raised, my mother's was a 25-year public school teacher here locally, as well as I've been to both public and private universities in state and out of state. And that's helped, I think, influence a lot of the decision making that I've made as a policymaker in the legislature. Lastly, I currently serve on a public charter school board of directors. So one of the things that I knew coming in was how kind of a public school K through 12 worked, but not necessarily some of the school choice options. And so I have volunteered to sit and serve on a board so I can understand better how those incentives, those finances, those grants work when we come to a school choice oriented environment. And so I think that's kind of the down and dirty for the intro, and we'll pass it along to Tara.
Thanks, folks. I come from a really different background compared to Jason. I'm a special education teacher, really. I think that the opportunity to mostly work with high school age students, but to also work with middle schoolers and a little bit with elementary schoolers has really influenced what I've done after stepping away from teaching for a while and going back to public policy school. I knew that I wanted to try to assist policymakers or become a policymaker with the experience that I had had because my students and I faced so many kind of silly roadblocks during the course of my teaching years in Los Angeles and up in the Portland, Oregon area. And so following some of my public policy education, I had the opportunity to intern with the New York City Department of Education. And that was a wonderful experience, just working on the very volatile topic of educator evaluation. Very, very useful insight, the opportunity to do internships from the public policy context, but specifically with a public agency. And since then, I've just done kind of an amalgamation of things that has helped me get a lot more breadth of understanding. I worked with a public school facilities design and finance firm for a little while. And that was very helpful, understanding, kind of the relationship between boards and the private sector. And that helped me when I went over to be a project manager for an HR director of a relatively large urban school district up here in Northern California. And I made my way over to apply my public policy education a little more broadly to make sure I knew how state programs generally were viewed by the legislature, but also by the public. So I worked for the state auditor's office for a couple of years, and luckily had the opportunity to review a lot of different kinds of education and also just social services types of programs. And now I kind of work in the job that I had envisioned in the first place, which is so wonderful. I work for the Department of Education here in California in Sacramento. And to that end, my office is called Teacher and Leader Policy, which gives some indication, but is also very broad. I think it gives them the opportunity to hand us a lot of different projects. But I came there, with a lot of focus on educator development and a real interest in retention issues, kind of the sleeper, until I'm sure you all know research has uncovered the last half a decade or so that it is, the elephant in the room. So I will get there, I guess, Sharon, as to, the topics that we really focus on. But in my role, I advise folks in the department when the legislature wants, some further understanding on policy that they're making, which is pretty regularly, especially throughout every spring in California. I'm one of the people who analyzes a lot of bills every year, and hopefully in the future helps develop more bills. I think the department's kind of getting back into that mode as well, following up on the beginning of the pandemic anyway. And I guess there's a little more to share, but I should leave it there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. So as you guys were both talking, it's clear you've had a lot of roles. You've had a lot of different hats on. Maybe some involve the same kind of skills. Some have different decision-making parameters involved. So from these different hats you have, the next question is really about, when it comes to your decision-making or whatever the role is you're playing in the policymaking process, where do you or the people around you go for information? where do you learn about special, specific education topics? Do you go to research? Do you go, where do you go? And along with that, what role might research play in that, if at all? And if it's okay, we'll just keep going kind of the same order. We'll go Jason, Tara, if that's okay. Then we just know what's happening.
As long as she doesn't accuse me of taking all the good answers first, and then she'll have to go first after that.
Yeah, okay.
So,
Yeah.
so the answer is it depends. It depends on what the issue is. I mentioned how many, we've got 40 senators in the state of Florida, and one of our senators is a former district administrator out of Miami. So when we have a very complicated policy issue that affects a school district, we have somebody who actually did that job as one of our colleagues, and that's very helpful. One of the things that I think is important to state early that will kind of be instructive about how it is you interact with your legislators is to put down the foundation that some of them deserve a lot of grace in this area, insofar as there's really no prerequisite to running for office. Literally anyone can win. All you have to do in my state is be 21 years old and an elector of your district. And that means that even if we elect the smartest person, the best person for that district, they're really only the smartest and best person in any one discipline. I came from Health and Human Services. If we're going to talk about hospitals or assisted living centers or whatever, I'm your guy. But I also still have to vote on K through 12 and civil justice and criminal justice and infrastructure and how we build bridges. And you got to pick up some of that stuff from some of your colleagues that know. And so one of the ways that we feel is instructive for our educational voting is to first rely on those who did that role with whom you agree with philosophically or not. Some of my best friends came from that role who are on the other side of the aisle from me, but I know they know what they're talking about. And that's very helpful for me when disseminating what is it we're trying to accomplish. So I think for me, a lot of it has to do with colleagues' advice, research that we've seen. Educationally, I have an undergraduate degree in agriculture. I have a master's degree in business, and I'm completing a second master's degree in public health. So I'm not afraid to dig into a white paper or a peer-reviewed journal or a placebo-controlled trial. Any of those are fine. I can read them all and get the references. That's helpful for me, but that may not be for everybody. Because as I mentioned, if it's a mortgage broker or it's a prosecutor, these are very bright people who may have never had access or exposure to some of the complicated nuances of what we're dealing with in education. And so that's why I say ask for a little bit of grace, is that as you're going to engage some of these legislators, just try and find out where they're at. If they haven't been in the legislature very long and they were, the most popular fill in the blank that doesn't have to do with education, maybe give them a little tutorial, tell them where we've been, tell them where we're trying to go. What is it you're trying to accomplish? Because they could be very bright people with very good intentions. They just don't have a foundational base to about something you may have spent your entire career researching.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Tara, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to start by echoing a theme that Jason brought up. It's going to sound like a recruitment video though, Jason. It is very impactful who you sit next to, whether it be in the voting chamber or, on floor 4 of the bureaucracy, right? In part because the way that our legislature has to operate in California, and from my understanding, most state legislatures do, time is such a challenging variable. And, we are often asked to weigh in on nuanced issues by the end of the day. And I have a much deeper and broader background, in educator development than most of the folks who work in the department. But that's why they hired me. And even for me, I mean, you all have heard what my background is. It certainly doesn't include a dissertation. And the research I did was very, kind of practical. It was applied public policy research. And so, as good a job as I can do in 8 or 12 hours can be really limited. And so it has been a huge benefit that, as Jason kind of suggested, I sit next to somebody who taught in a charter school, and I sit next to somebody who taught both in a charter school setting, was educated by a charter school operator to get her credential, and subsequently taught in a more traditional public school setting, folks who've taught different subject areas. I mean, it comes up all the time, on a weekly basis, that we call back to our specific practical experience prior to coming into roles as, explicitly policymakers. So I thought that was really important. I appreciate, Jason. I guess we're in some ways, two sides of the same coin. I need to work in that fashion because the legislators need to work in that fashion. So I would also say I probably have the luxury of more time in the off season, especially to do research on topics that I know from my background as a teacher and my background in studying public policy more broadly are going to, come back again and are building up to kind of a head and will need to be addressed, whether, very smart people in the legislature know it or not. I can see things coming a year or two ahead sometimes. So I definitely use academic journals. But those are for things that I can prepare well ahead of time for. I would say that there are a couple of research institutes in California that have become very relevant to my work because they're speaking, to questions that they know are going to be before the legislature in that same session. And they structure their, outreach newsletters along those lines. Like they say, here are 10 topics that we are currently doing research on, that, and they'll give you a little bit of history too. So you'll know why it was relevant recently and why it's likely to come up again. So those are some tips, but Jason, is this true for you? I would say that having to keep up with current events in my state really influences what I end up kind of being prepared for. So like our department creates a newsletter, every day just about with current events that they think our elected superintendent of public instruction will find important and that he would want, the rest of us to know about, everyone in the building. And I do make myself get through most of those news articles every single day so that I'm ready to answer questions, because that's part of my role at the department. And that ends up influencing very much what I'm actually prepared to do more deep work on. So.
Yeah, and you hit on it earlier when you said there's such a time crunch. Every state legislature makes a different choice as to how often it meets and for how long. In Florida, we meet for 60 days a year on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in March that runs to May, unless it's been, but basically 2 months of the year we meet and we do the entire state budget. We get through every single bill and that's it. And we go home and we do committee weeks and we do fundraising. We do all that other stuff that goes with it. Texas meets once every 2 years. New Hampshire meets continuously. So every state, you're going to have to find out when's the right time, almost like in getting in a game of double dutch, when's the right time to jump in for what would be the rhythm of your state. And then when that happens, it sometimes goes pretty quick. And if you've got current events that come up, if you've got something that needs to be addressed, and it's a school safety issue, which isn't even about curriculum, it's not even about outcomes. Now we're worried about hardening schools for a shooter. Those things have to be addressed by us in 48 to 72 hours, or people freak out that we're not acting fast enough. And that's a whole different issue. So trying to jam all of that through the funnel really makes me really rely on the folks who have spent the offseason really digging into these issues. Because when I call our Department of Education and say, hey, have you guys heard of this? And they say, oh yeah, we've known about this for 6 months. Here's what we think. We've got a paper on it. Here's what we're doing. That is super helpful, because I've only got, we're voting on it tomorrow. And so I've got basically tonight, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Tara. Yeah.
I'll just be brief. I forgot to say that I've had the opportunity to go to things that turned out to be really influential, kind of symposia and conferences. And I'm sent to those a lot of time to present information that districts need. Maybe that's more or less how California operates in comparison to, or in contrast to other states. But because I need to spend a lot of time preparing for those things, being there, answering questions for folks, and going to other sessions to learn about what districts and counties are doing in California, when academic research is presented at those types of conferences, that ends up having an outside influence absolutely on my work. So I just wanted to point that out. I just kind of realized it while we're talking.
So that's helpful. And as you both were talking, and you listed some really interesting strategies, that made me wonder what is a good approach. Like For example, the first thing being, Jason, when you talked about, and Tara, you did too, you go to the people in your group that know about this thing. So that makes me wonder, is that a strategy for researchers or, groups of researchers to reach out to the people in the decision-making community who are closest to education, go to them more than just go to everybody? Because it's like what I sort of wonder is, the people who don't have experience or, the background or that's not their area, they need it too. But it sounds like because of time and all these other factors that maybe a more efficient strategy is to target the folks that are closest to the discipline, if that's, one way to go about it. I don't know. Does that,
I would tell you
does that make sense? Yeah.
there's two effective ways. Well, there's two folks
Yeah.
that you can definitely go after. Number one is everybody should meet their own legislator. Those are the first emails I meet, the only meetings I'll take are people that live in my district that have concerns. And so meet that person first. But then second, Sharon, exactly what you were saying is because of my background in healthcare, I tend to get approached by the industry first because it's a complicated issue. There's a lot of background. There's a Canadian drug pricing strategy coming down the pike, and you're the person that understands it. I get all those issues before any other senator does, almost, because the industry needs to know that I get it, because they know that when they go to everybody else, I'm going to be the one they come to talk to. And so really it's a twofold strategy for everybody is go meet your legislator first, but then ask them in this policy area, who do you talk to? And then try and meet those chairs or those other folks that are either formal or informal leaders in the discipline.
Yeah. Tara, did you have anything to follow up on that? Okay.
I was just thinking hard about what Jason was saying.
Yeah.
In my opinion, from speaking from my various roles, not just my role at the department, I think the way you characterized it is really accurate in my experience, Sharon, out here. I think it'd be highly efficient if there was a lot of regular meeting, two-way communication between folks in my role so that I'm ready when Jason calls, you know what I mean? So I have the right white paper, or really so that I have a robust enough white paper. And that's so important, especially in my area, Jason. I bet there are other areas you've dealt with, but yeah, in educator development, there's so much to make sure you are really characterizing the reality based on current research. So anyhow.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So moving on to just education research and the kind of work we do, one question we had that we thought would be useful to hear from you on is what kind of, and you both are coming from sort of different backgrounds, of course, which makes this interesting, which is, what are the education topics that you wish you had more information about or that tend to come up with some regularity? What are the education issues? Now, obviously, Tara, I know you work with certain issues, but in your experience in looking around, and Jason looking around the legislature in Florida, what are the education issues that come up most frequently that are harder to deal with? I mean, any kind of characterization even that you can think of, and maybe I will ask Tara to go first this time. I will go back and forth.
Oh man, I'm so interested in Jason's answer.
Well, yeah, it's up to you too.
No, it's great. So there's a lot of attention right now, and has been the last couple of years, in particular, because our lives are governed by electoral politics. The governor came in really focused on education in a different way than the previous governor had, K-12 education, educator development, and with different kinds of partnerships with the various state agency heads, like the State Board of Education chair currently, for example. So there's just been so much attention on the areas that they hired me for anyway, that I'm trying to think what else besides educator retention, diversification of the educator workforce, and educator recruitment. There's so much to know. And I just really wish I had a think tank of people who could, help me make sure I'm really being educated about it at all times. But another thing that has been coming up a lot for me when it comes to trying to help make quick decisions about federal funding streams and flexibility that states have when they incorporate those into their more general fund oriented budgeting, is just overall support for educators and school communities. I know I'm trying to think of how to characterize that outside of holistic terms. I would really like help learning more about successful programs and, failed programs to help with housing, in rural areas where there's a lot of protected land. And so it's hard to even build housing, even if you can, which is already challenging sometimes. And recruiting and retaining folks to rural school districts where, there's plenty of housing, but it really is taking them out of where they came from, recruiting people who aren't just from the community and supporting them to really become part of the community quickly so that they feel like it's, something they can do to stay and make a life in a part of the state that, maybe where their nuclear family doesn't live, for example, as they want to, grow in their career and grow their families. So those are some things that were really on my mind as I was transitioning into family leave, which is actually what I'm currently doing this summer for family bonding. So, oh, man, there's so many things that come to mind for that, Sharon, but I'll just leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Jason.
So I think I'm probably the only person on here who's not a trained educator. I'm one of the laymen from the community who was one of those ones lucky enough to get just enough votes to be in this situation. And so coming from, my mom's a fourth grade teacher for years. I went to public school. I came into the legislature and I said, I got it. I'm going to fix it, because education is not unlike healthcare, in which everybody has some exposure and experience to it, but very few have actually ever done it as a practitioner, have actually taught, or actually has been a doctor, and so it's hard because everyone you talk to has an opinion on this stuff because they went to public school or they went to school. So I come in and I said, all right, tell me what the number one driver is for success for a child, and we're going to do it. And the folks who do the research in the state of Florida said, well, we're not sure you can do this. And I said, listen, I just got elected. Of course I can do this. And they said, well, the number one factor that we found for success in a child's educational outcome is that they have two parents at home that care. And I said, that care. And I said, all right, well, maybe I can't do anything about that. What's like the second biggest driver? And they said, well, it's that they got a good night's sleep. They weren't up listening to mom and dad fight. They weren't listening to drug deals on the corner or sirens. And so this gets to security and housing and a lot of other social issues, health and human service issues. And I thought, all right, well, that's a slightly bigger question. How about the third thing that's the driver? And they said, well, that they show up fed and ready to learn. I said, all right, well, we have some free and reduced lunch programs. Maybe we add some breakfast programs. I said, what's the fourth one? And they said, don't judge us, but it's that English is a first language at home. Where's the part where I can get involved with something that I've actually learned to try and drive the outcomes for these kids? And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to figure out some of these external factors that relate to a child's success. Because if I come in and say, I'm going to send everybody to college because we're going to give all third graders a standardized test, but I don't address those other four things, not many more people are going to college because I gave them a test in the third grade. That doesn't make as much sense. So one of the things that we're doing, there's two things that we're doing to help address some of the factors. One is the acknowledgement of mental health as a great big driver earlier versus later. I mentioned that my mother was a teacher. My wife is the former secretary of the Department of Juvenile Justice in Florida, which means she saw every manner of bad outcome for a child that maybe didn't have the best upbringing for whatever reason. They had suffered some number of adverse childhood events, and those aggregated to a point where they became involved in our correction system much earlier than they should have. And her opinions on a lot of this had to do with a lot of mental health issues that developed early that could have been addressed by social services that just weren't, whether it was for lack of identification, a lack of availability, however we prioritized our funding in the state of Florida. And Florida's a little unique versus some other states in that we have a balanced budget amendment. So we can only spend what we bring in. We don't borrow, we're totally balanced in that regard, but it limits us on what we can put investments in. Now we will bond roads and stuff like that long term, but by and large, so when we're prioritizing things, we really are prioritizing them versus other things, because we'd only have a finite amount of money. The second, so what we did was part of what our school safety bill did a couple of years ago, is that we put community action teams, or CAT teams, in all 67 of Florida's counties. That's the total number. And these are multidisciplinary healthcare teams that are able to identify and have some sort of intervention for children that may be identified as having some kind of mental health issue before it gets into an event. And so we now have resources dedicated to trying to identify and treat kids that may have some emerging social service issue, which will break down that barrier to them learning. The second thing we've done this year is part of hardening is that we've taken those federal dollars that Tara had alluded to and prioritized those towards putting broadband in all of our counties. If we think about the delivery of education and its equity and what a right it is to the rest of society, we're, like it or not, COVID's forced us all to kind of rethink how we deliver our education online and how much of it is delivered online. And so we think that by the state being able to put in an enormous amount of connectivity throughout every county, no matter how rural, because those are housing and all those are certainly challenges for us too, that will allow all of our citizens kind of an equity in terms of the right to education. So I would say for us, mental health and access to broadband are kind of the two things we're investing in right now.
Go ahead, Tara.
Okay, I don't want to sidetrack us too much, Sharon. I can't remember what question we're on. But something that Jason's comments reminded me about is how helpful it would be to be confident and really articulate about the current state of appropriate evaluation methods for the programs that legislators have already put in place. So that, when a bill is proposed in January and February, we can advise on that. It's absolutely, it comes at the end of the conversation far too often, whereas it probably should come at the beginning of the conversation almost every time. How are we going to know this was successful? And with the more whole child support that Jason was just describing about mental health, that is bound to be successful in some way or other. But I could absolutely see a program like that taking flack because maybe people say, oh, well, how many children is it really affecting? And what outcomes can you show for that? And I'm sure that legislators in Florida, thought about that and we're like, okay, well, we know which students we're targeting. We have, as Jason said, limited funds, limited priorities every year. And so in my work, for me to be better at my work, it would really assist to be updated maybe regularly, every fall, what have we learned over the past year or two, that has changed what we think are the most accurate evaluation methods. And what do you guys think of some of the bills that went through, really breaking down examples, I think would help people in my position, breaking down examples of what, professors think has been really well done about certain bills that maybe you don't see in other bills and why. I think that would really help my team as well.
So this is great. So one thing Tara said was a question that Jennifer had brought up in the chat that would be a good time to address that now about how you characterize your view of the school's role in society. Tara's exactly right. When you come up with an idea that says we need to have this wraparound services for our kids, it really brings up the question, well, what is now school's role? If we're feeding them and we're providing all these social services, what are we really trying to prove? Because we have a Department of Health, we have food stamps, we have all these other programs that are available. What is really the school's role? And so what we had to really come up with was in this great panacea of what we could provide, we think, well, then all kids should have access to telemedicine. If we're going to do broadband and social services, this is great. And you have to ask the question, what is the school's role? So with regard to these particular CAT teams, they were really centered around preventing an event. If a child needed ongoing therapy or needed ongoing intervention, that's really going to be on them and their family or other structures of social service like Medicaid to provide that, because it's not the school's core function to just be the provide everything to every kid. And that's really a struggle. And Tara hit the nail on the head. You have limited funds. And so where is it appropriate that we insert this?
Yeah, go ahead, Tara.
Oh, no, I'm good. I was just unmuting.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you raised some good points. And actually, in some ways, it has me thinking about on the researcher side, there's a lot more emphasis on, in my view, and I'd love the audience to weigh in if they have any questions or comments on this, but to be more interdisciplinary. That's sort of our version of this, is to not just focus on one aspect of a child's, academic engagement, so to speak, but, care in our world, it's care about the context, care about the circumstances, care about sort of the broader holistic picture of a kid's actual learning experience and teaching practices, to try to understand the more of the complicated nature, because all these variables are important. They do matter. And that question, what is the school's role, is important. I mean, yeah. So good. I was thinking, and we'll interrupt if someone has another thought on that topic at any point. But as you were talking, one question I also have has to do with the relative role of national or federal, state, and local policies. How do they interact, or is that an issue, or how do you think of those three layers and where your input is? So I'm assuming, Jason, yours is more state level, but a lot of researchers are already do or thinking about more local impact. And so how does that all kind of feature in your thinking and decision making, keeping in mind, what's the role of research again? And all of these things. So how would you think about all those systems, if you will? Jason or Tara, go ahead. No,
okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I changed my role and messed you up, but
go
ahead, Tara. Yeah.
So just stop me, Sharon, if I'm not really answering like what you were meaning to ask. I think about how the state and local level interact a lot. I think about how the federal level interacts with the local level, and how the federal level interacts with the state level to a much lesser degree, especially in the last, let's say, 8 months. I'm not thinking as much about how federal decisions are going to impact state decisions. So I'm at the state level, but everything I do has to be implemented, not just by districts, but by counties. In California, there's a principle that has been in play here and very forceful for the last decade, and we just call it local control and local accountability. So when the legislature charges people like me with creating a grant program, we essentially put it out for counties and sometimes districts, sometimes consortia of a combination of those, to apply to actually implement it. So the actual implementation of a lot of legislative intent and a lot of the people's intent, like everyone who is contacting folks like Jason. So the actual implementation ends up being up to local ability, local capacity, to start a grant program in their region or in their district. And it also ends up being very much subject to local Board of Education priorities. And so one thing that hopefully that's clear enough, but please ask, Sharon. One thing that I think is really interesting about that I just want to mention is we often look to, like we had a program here that we view as very successful called the Bilingual Teacher, BTPDP, Bilingual Teacher Preparation and Development Program, I think. Professional development program. So that program was, authorized, like requested by the legislature, and it ended up being implemented in a very select, several places in the state, not statewide. But because we view it as a very successful program, a lot of my work, advising people about grant programs subsequent to that program, relies on like saying, okay, yeah, that was successful. Something like that can do really well again. But what if, totally different counties end up applying to implement the next grant? What if, state board or local Board of Education turnover means that local communities' priorities are totally different and they end up implementing the program differently? I just wanted to point that out. Maybe that's a little too abstract for folks who aren't in my role, but I think that's a really helpful dynamic to know about. And I don't know how it is in Florida, Jason, but I'd love to.
So to start, very similar, Tara, to what you said is, and this may be a political statement, but outside of funding, we don't find much value in the federal policy making world because we're always comparing ourselves to other states, really. And for Florida legislators anyway, we tend to think about comparable states in two different boxes. One are the southern states for obvious reasons. That's geographic and economic, and what are they doing all around us? But the other are the big states. California, and by population, it's California, Texas, us, New York, and then Illinois, because Chicago's so big. And so we tend to ask, what are those other four states doing as part of the big states? Then relative to the locals, Florida has 67 counties, as I mentioned, but all 67 counties have their own school board who elect their own superintendent. And in Florida, we tend to think about Florida divided into three different states. There is the Panhandle, which is affectionately called Southern Georgia or Lower Alabama. There is Central Florida, so Jacksonville and the theme parks down to about Lake Okeechobee. And then there's South Florida, which is a very different flavor from everything. And when we implement state policy that has to be implemented by 67 locals in three very distinct regions, we have to be really careful about what we do, that it can be implemented. And a lot of that we struggle with from a capability standpoint. And so one of the programs that I'll mention is that we had a teacher pay program that was based on effectiveness. And I was advocating for my local county. Out of the 67 counties, my home county is generally ranked between 1 and 5 out of the 67. And it's because we're suburb, we have a lot of committed teachers, we have a lot of engaged parents. There are a lot of reasons for those outcomes. But I'm always looking for things that would be like voluntary pre-kindergarten and have that paid. That's a nice to have when everything else is taken care of. So when I advocate for things like some expansion of services, they say, well, in your county, there are 3,200 teachers that are rated as effective or highly effective for bonus purposes. And I said, okay. And they said, what do you think that's like in other counties? And I said, it's probably somewhere ratio wise scaled somewhere around the same. And they said, no. How many of those teachers do you think live in Jefferson County, which is the county just outside the state capital, county just outside Tallahassee? And I said, well, if we have 3,200 and our population's X and they have Y, then it's probably about, I don't know, 400. And they said, no, it's 0. The entire county doesn't have anybody effective or highly effective. And so we then have to put our focus as a state just in one district. Because if we've got half of our districts that seem like they're, for lack of a better term, on cruise control, they've got good superintendents, they've got plenty of teachers, they're implementing what we want to implement. We very frequently have got to chase the leaky bucket, which is pockets of the state in which those kids are not going to Harvard. Those kids are, we got to do our best just to get them to minimum skills to graduate, because they don't have the infrastructure available to do that. So we have almost no interaction with the feds from a policy standpoint. We do love the money when it comes down, because then we can do things like wire the schools and fix the roofs and the AC and stuff like that. But we really, as the state, are in total partnership with our locals to try and implement all this to get us to a place where maybe from 4th we can go to 3rd or 2nd. We certainly don't want to go to 15th, but we're really focused in working with our locals to get our state to be at a higher place.
Sharon,
Yeah.
I would add that one thing that would be enormously helpful is when working with researchers, if they can help people like me have context for successes in states, cities, districts, regions, countries even, which we don't typically compare ourselves to. I would say that maybe to a lesser extent, but we do a lot of what Jason said. We compare ourselves to other large states, and that has influence, pros and cons, definitely, on the decisions that we make in California about what to try. And I think our state, I think any state would really benefit from having the time, or at least like the perspective, with a quick phone call about like why something really innovative in Vermont, like with public transportation, is replicable in California, or why it's not, to really understand what the barriers are that may be similar or different. And I can't think of an audience beyond this audience that is more, prepared to help us understand things like that. And that is absolute for me personally. That has absolutely been missing, the ability to help folks like Jason understand, why it is relevant to bring a program from rural New Mexico to rural Northern California, for example.
Yeah, and this is all making me think, and I'm wondering, Terry, you've sort of referenced this more, this notion of, seeking out information from researchers, but I guess more for Jason, in the state legislature sort of culture, I mean, is there a place for partnerships to happen where researchers can partner with legislators to kind of either initiate projects relevant to some decision making? Now, the other side of this that I'm hearing in my head is there's no time. You got to make a decision, and you got to already know. But I guess the only way for us as a way for us as researchers to do work that might pinpoint some of this issues, really we have to have relationships almost with legislators to come up with the questions to examine. So not only could we be contacts for what works where, we can kind of help find that, but also do work in a certain area should it be something that we're interested in doing. I'm just wondering about what could change in this culture of decision making that can bring in or fold in researchers more, because the other piece that you guys are talking about in terms of the local enactment, that's an area where EdPsych is our discipline is really perfectly primed to shine light on. How does a policy play out in District A, District B, District C, or even in schools within the district or with these types of students? I mean, that's the kind of scholarship utilizing a variety of methods that, and we have, very strong utilitarian sort of theoretical frameworks that we can bring to bear to these contexts to kind of help shine a light on, wow, what's happening here, there, elsewhere, throughout a state, throughout a context, because that's kind of how that would be kind of the way we would frame sort of the local situation as it relates to state level, because there's state level policy, but it plays out differently, obviously, throughout these contexts that we need to understand more of. Am I kind of hitting?
Yeah.
Is that resonating? Because I'm
Yeah.
trying to help sort of articulate more for researchers what you can do, how to think about the application of your science to questions of policy.
So there's a couple of points in there. Number one is I'm always open to research for new stuff because that's how we advance the field. And again, coming from healthcare, that is the backbone of all the advancement of the field is the research that comes out. And part and parcel to that is clinical trials that test these things on smaller populations in hopes that it's applicable to the broader population. When we're talking about educational research, that is also the same kind of similar process. The issue that we have in states like Florida and in California and New York and these big ones I mentioned is that they're exceedingly diverse states. And that's great for us. The hazard is that in any research setting, you have a finite number of subjects because you have a finite number of amount of money to do this. And so if you have 1,000-person study, that's great, but I'm going to want to see your demographic breakout so I know what district in Florida looks like that so I can pilot it. Because what's going to happen is you're going to bring me a study from Kansas and go, wouldn't this be great to do in all of Florida? And I'm going to say, you mean like Miami? Kansas and Miami do not look alike. The social mores and norms are different. The cultures are different. The primary language is different. There are a lot of things that would not be applicable, even from a wonderfully done, very well-controlled research study. It's really going to depend on your subjects. And then the expertise of the legislator to say, number one, this is great findings. And number two, this is the area of my state in which this would be applicable. Let's pilot it, see what we can learn, hear from the folks on the ground and see whether or not it's replicable and where and how fast we should do it and who needs to be involved and how much money. Because it may be depressing to hear, but people come to us all the time with ideas. And Florida has tried to get a little bit out of the pilot business because we realized we were running 600 pilots at once. We were never actually making full policy. We just had a lot of pilots running everywhere. So you really need a disciplined plan about what success looks like and then what the next steps are once you meet those thresholds and benchmarks. It's relatively scientific. One of the things that really hurts this, and again, this is a little political, is term limits. is that, yes, people love term limits because you get to throw the bums out. Well, in my time, I've worked with, hundreds of legislators, handful of bums, most of them actually pretty good people who are well-meaning, writing to do the job, but they get thrown out just as fast. Where that hurts is in long-term policy changes, is that if I know I've only got 6 years in office because the Constitution says I got to go find a new hobby, I'm not going to embark on anything that doesn't take less than 6 years to do. And so when you talk about long-term changes, states with term limits are tough.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that from both of you. Jennifer has another question in the chat. I'll just go ahead and raise it. I think it's a good one. What space is there for teachers to serve as a voice to influence policymakers? So what role do teachers play? Do they get involved at all in any of your experiences?
How much time do you have?
Well, we have, yeah, plenty.
Jason, you first. I think the answers will be very different.
Yeah, so teachers are involved all the time, but not in the good ways that you think they are. The Florida Teachers Association, or the Florida Education Association, is at times a radical arm of the Democratic Party. And in a Republican-led legislature, we work with groups of all stripes, and they seem to be the ones that for whom nothing is ever good enough. Whether we do recruitment bonuses, whether we put starting salaries more, there's always some kind of problem. And it's always about the teachers not getting more money. It doesn't have anything to do with educational outcomes. It doesn't have anything. It just has to do with protecting traditional public schools and giving the teachers more money. We know from all of our studies that dollars per pupil in the classroom does not directly correlate to educational outcomes. It's all over the board. The District of Columbia spends like 4 times the money we do per pupil in the classroom and has a quarter of the outcomes. And so we are trying to find a place where we can work with teachers in a constructive way when the first, second, and third things out of their mouth aren't give us more money, because we know that's not directly correlated to the outcomes, which is what we want. We want good outcomes. We would love for our teachers to be happy, but we would like kids to have be competitive in a global economy first. And so I think, even though I love it, my mom's a teacher, I want to embrace them and hold them and hug them and get all their ideas. Their ideas are 11th, because 1 through 10 is give us more money, and that clouds the message all the time. Yes, that could be a part of the function, but it can't be primary, secondary, tertiary before we even get to the policy parts.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, Tara.
I think it's a great question, and it's, for me, it probably should be my first question, like every Monday when I show up, to get started again. Like, what is the role? What could the role be? What makes sense? I will say that in my work, I think there's a lot of flexibility, just the way that my department operates right now, the way that other policy roles that I've had have operated. I think that there is very little that hinders me from, contacting a local district and asking to speak with, the department chair for science for every high school. I mean, it could be that informal, the way that teachers get contacted by folks like me. It is not necessarily that way. Like maybe in Florida, maybe in many states, there are protocols that would restrict that, kind of like off the top of your head initiating conversation. But the way that that my colleagues and I have worked recently, I don't think that we have those barriers. So that could work well for me, and kind of has so far. But I think that avenue is actually two-way. I mean, my phone number is public record, and I think it is incumbent upon me and folks like me to do the reaching out in the first place, because, as I'm sure Jason and all of us would wish, like, teachers are very focused on other things. But I think that in my experience, I've kind of alluded to this, Sharon, it has been really helpful to have kind of like standing meetings, like regular conversation with the same group of folks, at least over the course of a year, in part because teachers' schedules are so varied. I mean, they can be so busy with testing, in one city, during a certain point in the year. But other regions, they could come participate in a conversation about like, well, what did recruitment even look like at your site last year? Or, if you're talking to HR folks, what did recruitment look like in your district? So I think that it could look a lot of ways. But to answer the question itself a little more directly, um, there are teachers who end up having the opportunity, sometimes applying, but sometimes just being called upon by leaders in their district, or even directly by legislators like Jason, to serve on a committee, to advise on, we had a charter school task force, for example, a couple of years ago. And that was very informative work that they did, and folks from all different backgrounds, some of whom were just, at that time, at least classroom teachers, and were able to voice, their opinions. And right now at the department, there are a couple different work groups, and some of them include mostly, educators on what would the role be of teacher workforce diversification. What do we mean about diversification? What does effectiveness even look like when you are diversifying your workforce? So there may be more to say. I may be forgetting, ways that teachers are involved, but one thing Jason said about, educator unions being involved in politics at my level is absolutely true. But I actually haven't had the opportunity to, know what they think, kind of at a collective level of a lot of the policies that I work on. But I am able to access public meetings where representatives come and kind of like make their thoughts known, like in a more detailed fashion than just news headlines. So those are some of the things that definitely are off the top of my head accurate for my whole career so far about how teachers are and are not involved.
And I forgot one thing that is that Tara reminded me of that is totally pertinent to Jennifer's question. I probably should have led with this instead of the other thing that I said. You guys wouldn't believe this based on my last answer, but I have a great relationship with my school board and a lot of my principals here. I grew up in the neighborhood, so I still know all the schools. And one of the great ways that teachers can serve to influence policymakers is invite them to come teach. Once a semester, I go to the high schools and I do either US history or economics or Constitution Day. And there is nothing more humbling for a legislator than to stand in front of a bunch of 15-year-olds and try and teach them economics or US history. And it is great. And it is a total game-changing equalizer to have kids ask questions, because they're honest and they'll just tell you what's going on at the dinner table. So it's great as a policymaker to hear what's going on at the families. But that then gets you great relationships with the high school, middle school teachers in the community, even if they invite them to come read to your kids if you're a third grade teacher. That is a great way for me to stay in tune with what's going on and on the ground in my community versus just hearing from somebody at the district level or whatever else we're working on. And so I would say for those of you that are in schools, invite them to come teach and see who takes you up on it.
Jason, that was so great. It's so good to have like concrete examples. Also, that's an excellent story. I will recommend it immediately to all the legislators to take advantage.
The questions I get asked are like, if you can answer those, there's no meeting I won't go to. There's no homeowners association meeting that gets angrier than like a group of 16-year-olds when you're talking about red light cameras and stuff like that.
Jason, as a former US history and civics and economics teacher, yes, indeed. I just wanted to add something that his anecdote made me think of, which is I developed this whole program and presentation, partly in consultation with a teacher, an amazing teacher, and a teacher leader as it happened, and a person who was actually getting her dissertation, because I was able to attend her session at a conference that they sent me to present information that folks like her, administrators in her district were going to need. I mean, there's that kind of like, people say networking and, it has a lot of bad connotations, especially for folks who are not bureaucrats, but that kind of like efficient, getting a chance to meet and then speak in depth and follow up with a teacher. That is one of the ways that I have been able to do that, to develop relationships where someone like her, who is doing such important, relevant work on a daily basis, she feels like, she really will take the time to get back to me. I mean, there's another reason, it's like lack of time on the educator side, not just like lack of time on the side of folks like me, as to why there isn't more, robust two-way communication, why I don't consult many teachers on every single policy that comes before me, which I think would actually be like job one for someone like me. I mean, ideally, that's how I'll be operating in a few years. We'll see.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. Thank you both for that. I mean, there's just so much to process here by way of ways to think about connecting with different decision makers, ways of communicating. Even just small things can lead to, an invitation to teach in a class can really lead to who knows what over time. So it sounds like that's one like kind of big takeaway from this, is just to reach out, try, as an individual scholar, there's a lot of things we can do on the individual level. But in terms of the research and looking at the time, now that we've hit 4:00, I guess the last question I want to pose, and we can see if there's any other questions that pop up from the community, is what kind of final or ending advice do you have for educational researchers? Because most of those who will be on this and listening to your insights do research, are in the academic, or non-academic, but pursue research. And so I guess from your perspective, do you have any other advice for us in terms of the research we do, the strategies we might take on to try to have our work make more of a difference in policy and in practice? So anything you can leave us with? And Jason, you want to go first this time?
There's so much. It's great. I mean, this is related to everything. And so one of the things that I would say is one of the things that I think has made Florida very successful in the last 20 years has been our movement towards some kind of parental choice within how it is that their education is delivered, whether that's online, whether it's through a voucher, whether it's through a public charter school, whether it's through your traditional public school. But that is based on the premise that you have parents that care about where you're going and don't just view your school as the neighborhood babysitter. And so there's so much stuff that comes into how do we get folks ready for a global economy? And that could be going to college, it could be vocational ed, it could be just going to get a job. And how do we make those choices? Where is the right place for us to start steering folks towards their future? And there's no good answer. And I don't know how to advise folks for how to advise legislators to do that, because for every novel, great idea we have, there are going to be communities for whom that's just not appropriate or correct. And so I would say research right now around the impact of mental health on performance, as well as the outcomes that are from alternative delivery models, such as vouchers online, like that sort of thing. We've had research in Florida recently that showed that during the pandemic, male children of single parents are further behind than every other group in terms of learning gains for the last year. That's fascinating for us. What does that mean? What does it mean socially for us? What does it mean in terms of wraparound services? Do we have to fund programs for folks this summer to get them back up to speed because they lost their gains through COVID? And what does that mean for other kinds of structures? So I think there's a lot that goes on with the delivery models that we have right now in terms of outcomes. And a lot of that has to do with some of those other social services, and to what degree is the school responsible for that versus other parts of public policy.
Yeah, Tara, sorry. Yep, I did it. I violated it. I almost made it through without doing that. Yeah, and Tara, I'm sorry to kind of jump in before we get to your response. I guess I'm wondering, how do we, there is a lot of research on choice. We kind of know a lot about different delivery systems of education. We do know some about mental health. That's out there.
I'll give you another choice model of a bill that I'm going to run this year. It is that a licensed teacher may set up their own homeschool version in their neighborhood through contracts with parents. Mm-hmm. So now we're saying that you have to be out of the public model for at least 1 year, because we don't want anybody to think we're rating teachers. But you could get to a place where a licensed teacher in your state could have a contract with 5 parents to teach their kids every day in the neighborhood. And so what
Yeah.
does that look like?
I
And so
mean,
it's
I
kind
could
of
guess what it,
evolving.
yeah, I mean, I guess I could guess what it looks like, but rather than kind of getting in the weeds on that specific idea, which is, something to think about. Um, the point I was kind of getting to is there is that research out there, and I'm not sure it's getting through. I'm not sure it's being appropriated in the thinking. And I don't know if it's because there's a rush to make decision, if it's a ideological worldview, politics
It's a
kind of
lot
a
of
situation.
ideological.
So yeah, I'm sorry, Jason. I guess that
uh,
leads just before I forget, because I want to forget, like, you're very open, Tara's in a slightly different position, but very open. Like, how open are legislatures? It seems like the world's going nuts these days to being, to listening to what the data actually
So
say.
it gets back to the anybody can run. Those that have been doing it for a while, know the data, have confidence, and can argue it in front of an HOA crowd. Now that I'll go back to your homeowners association. Those that can field questions on it, why do we do it? What is it? They are open to these kinds of things. I think what happens is you get new folks, and I'm a general contractor, so bring me all of your construction issues and your zoning laws and all that, but I'm not really comfortable yet in discussing what would be a nuanced issue within K through 12 because I just haven't had experience. I haven't served on that committee. I'm not exactly sure what our financing program is for it. And it takes a little while to get folks comfort with this. At the end of the day, you can't really take politics out of the politics. So relationships matter
Mhm.
because you want to be able to have a cup of coffee with somebody and say, what do you really think about this? What do you really think the outcomes or the consequences of this might be? And for those that have had some exposure and a little confidence, they can go, yeah, I could kind of see this working. And it takes a little while to do it. This job is a job like any other that you're probably better at it 5 years later than you were the day you got in. And it
Mhm.
takes a little while to get there for something that could be as nuanced as education.
Sure. Sure. Thank you for that. Tara, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, this is it's such a privilege to be part of this conversation. I just want to say that it's very interesting and it's a great question, Sharon. And I really see what you mean. I I absolutely would say, I think you're kind of alluding to this, Sharon, like perhaps research grants don't come with money that you're allowed to use to spend time on a communication strategy. You know what I mean? I just always assumed that that's kind of the case because it really would be so ideal if we could regularly get updated, on the results of, especially, the bigger programs that have, public funding on what the, research is revealing that's, particularly relevant to our state or a community that we're focused on, like Jason described earlier. So yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely a question of how can folks who are already working hard, like you guys are, Sharon, in your field, carve out some time to develop relationships. Like I'll get a blast for things that I have proactively subscribed to about research that is about to come, and then once the research comes, they'll send out a second email or hold a second event that I could attend where they discuss the research. And then I can be prepared to talk to somebody like Jason, like when they come calling, at least if they end up having time even between all the voting. But even that is so limited. I mean, there's a group of professors in California, teacher preparation professors, educator preparation professors, who I can really see, so all the work that they're putting in to their association to make sure that they are starting to have regular, I'm sure they've been doing it for much longer than I would even know, but having regular meetings that they are willing to let someone like me come and observe, and then having a symposium every year, maybe even putting it in the state capitol so that legislators can attend. And yeah, I see a point about like monthly briefings. Yes, something that's regular just ends up being something that you get so much more traction for. People start having faith in your commitment to being a partner because you have committed a regular, consistent time to be available to them, essentially, to educate them or whatever it is, break down a bill possibly. So I think that I see so much room for possibility. I don't think that legislatures are cut off in the way that, many of us might worry they are sometimes. I just don't think that. I think Jason's right. Everything he said about ideology and politics being a critical part of the careers of the folks who are doing the work in the legislature. But ultimately, at the end of the day, legislators are public servants of their particular communities and of, their state, but very much their particular communities. And if researchers make it transparent to the public also, if researchers have the kind of communication access, communication strategy where really lucky parents who have the time to pay attention to this, and mayors of cities who are trying to partner with their schools more effectively, if the public outside of the kind of Department of Education and legislature dichotomy knows enough about research that's coming as well, they can demand that legislators use that research. That is the least articulate way that I wanted to describe something like that, but I think that's critical, because ultimately having public awareness and transparency on your research can, it'll influence what legislators want to do and what they're even aware of, because then, concerned school boards will actually contact Jason and say, hey, have you heard about this? We think this is going to be cool for our community, and let me tell you why. And then he'll know how to advocate also with respect to his colleagues, because he'll know how to say that it would impact his, neighborhoods and why, and that'll, help other people decide if that would be similar in their neighborhoods.
So this sparked two comments. Is perfect, Tara. Is number one, I'm one of the idiots that puts their cell phone number and their email and all their communications to their constituents. So people call me all the time, and I spend most of my afternoons on my back porch with a cigar and a bourbon, and I just call everybody back that called, and they can call about whatever, and we can talk about it. And so I hear about a lot of stuff that's coming that way, because in particular, this year I forgot to mention, I'm chair of Environment and Natural Resources. So we in Florida, that's a really big deal, whether it's springs or beaches or red tide or Lake Okeechobee or whatever. And there are a lot of environmental engineers who live in my district who have ideas about this stuff, and so they want to call and talk, and I'm happy to chat with all of them. But the second thing that I was going to mention was, what was the last thing you said, Tara? It was really good. Is you remember what the last thing was?
It was about transparency on research for a public audience, so that people your constituents can actually contact you.
This is what it was. This was the second point, and this was even better than me putting my phone number on stuff, is that the most effective advocacy that happens, and this is across the board, is if you can approach a legislator and say, this is a great idea, and here's what we should do for everybody. The next question for me or a legislator should be, okay, who's going to hate it? And be honest with them. Just say, listen, this flies in the face of what we've done for 50 years. And so you're probably going to get pushback from some senior teachers or people that aren't willing to embrace this, or just be honest about who, because there's nothing worse than me calling the superintendent and saying, let's go do this. And he goes, but haven't you heard this argument? And me going, no. And so that's a really effective way to communicate too, is to say, just be honest about what the downside is. There's a downside to everything. Otherwise it wouldn't be a policy argument. We know that. So go ahead and be open about it, because that makes us even stronger advocates for it when we know there's no other shoe that's going to fall if I go out in public and make some kind of statement.
Wow, what fantastic points. Thank you all for that. And as I start to kind of make some closing statements, I just want to encourage the audience to please feel free to put in comments or any lingering questions. But these ideas that are coming out are just really things I haven't thought of. The notion of the transparency notion and the communication notion, and just, I've been sort of the policy committee of our group and those who are kind of interested in policy from a researcher perspective and dabbling in how do we, sort of get stuff out? How do we communicate? I mean, yes, we can always approach someone individually, but we can't mandate that researchers do that. So how do we as a group kind of do that? How does, as an entity, do that? And so this is just this is not only affirmation, but just gives me some ideas for things that we can continue to work on pursuing and doing, in addition to just blasts and policy briefs, kind of making the information even more, somehow more palatable and salient to the folks who would use it and or need it. Yeah. Any other thoughts that are coming up as we're sort of winding down, Tara and or Jason? I don't want to necessarily open up another area. I think, we're kind of getting to the end, and then, respecting people's times might be time to kind of start winding down. So maybe turn to last thoughts. Tara, do you have some final sort of thoughts you want to bring?
Sure. I would say that the questions that Sharon, you and your colleagues brought to this are really good questions, and it just makes me think you guys are right on already about how you guys are going to work to move forward, the way that research is used. I just think you guys, you're asking the right questions, and that's so critical, right? And that reminds me that a role that research should play in public policy making, at least according to my education in public policy school, is helping us decide what are the right questions in the first place. I mean, of course, researchers shouldn't be the only ones to get to figure out what are the right questions, but it's like you said, Sharon, there's so much that's already known, but as we've discussed, like, it's very difficult to make sure that folks like myself and Jason know all the things that researchers who've worked so hard in like the somewhat siloed field of academia have know because of their immersion and the efficiencies in academia to find out about all different kinds of research quickly. So I want to say that in government, having money to communicate well is a critical issue, period. And so I know that from your side, that's going to be a real challenge. I guess to me, a through line in this is whatever you all come up with, and whatever folks like Jason come up with. I think having a sustainable plan to help people in the legislature and people who work for the legislature and for the governor to help all of us understand research like in a relationship based way. I think sustainable meetings like David Jens in the chat alluded to, like monthly briefings. It seems like it's more sustainable for researchers, and I know that it's more effective than just kind of like one-off outreach from individuals. So I just want to advocate for that. Whatever is sustainable for you guys is probably what you should do, because those relationship building strategies just end up being the ones that people like me use when we have to do quick communication,
right?
During the spring. So,
yeah. And can I just, before we turn to you, Jason, thank you for that, Tara. I want to emphasize too to those listening to this about the type of research. We've talked a lot about sort of help us know from your point of view, help us know what works and what I can do where. So there is that sort of category of research, the experimental design type of research, the sort of intervention, like that is all built around questions of what works. But it's equally, maybe if not more important, are questions about how do things work? How is it working? And that's where different types of methodologies, mixed methods types of methodologies, or qualitative, or whatever it might be, can be brought to bear to questions on how policy is operating. Just what does it look like in action over time? It may not give you a conclusive answer that a lot of policymakers, I think, want, which is this yields this number of improvements, and this yields this number of non-improvements. That's not the only way research can be used. Research can be used to kind of describe, wow, with these kinds of kids, if you do this, it kind of tends to yield this kind of story. So I think, I just also want to encourage that those listening, that all types of research can be brought to bear to the questions of policy, not just what works, and using large samples and that kind of thing is of course very important, and many of us do that kind of stuff, but other kinds of questions are important for uncovering other aspects of policy and policy enactment, particularly at the local level. So yeah, so the different outcomes are, not just standardized tests are not the only kind of outcome or achievement. Maybe an outcome is, some other psychological measure. So there's lots of things to throw into the basket, in terms of what policy research or research with policy in mind toward inform policy could look like. So with that, I think, Tara, that's yours. Yeah, what obstacles has to overcome. I don't know if that's something you want to address. I think you could see the chat, Jason, if we want to turn to you for some like wrapping up questions or thoughts on it.
Sure. Well, I can briefly talk about the good outcome measures issue. Is we have tried very consistently in Florida to figure out a way to pay good teachers well. What does good look like? And as my mom, who's a teacher, can tell you, every teacher in there knows the three teachers that aren't that good. And so, but we can't really use that as a metric for paying people bonuses, or there has to be a quantitative function. There has to be a qualitative function. Maybe you put a function in there of the overall school's performance. When you do bonuses, do you do that for, do you give bonuses to the ancillary help like the custodians and the folks that work in the kitchen? There are all kinds of issues that we've come up with. We even had a program where we were paying bonuses to folks based on their ACT or SAT coming out of high school, because we wanted to retain the best and the brightest and stop them from going into another career when really we need those really sharp people in the teaching profession. So the answer is we've tried a whole bunch of stuff, and I can't tell you exactly what is good. Keep trying, please. As part of wrap-up thoughts, thank you all for being here. The fact that you all are here and doing this is the exact folks that we want to talk to. I would encourage you to meet your state legislators. You've all got one state house member and one state senator. Call them both. See who will meet with you. They both should. Maybe you gel with one over the other one. Maybe you like both. But you know, I routinely receive a manila envelope with a Post-it note on a white paper that says maybe this is a good idea for a bill, and I read them. And maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe we already do it and we just don't publish it that well. But there are a lot of folks who are engaged in this and want to do this. A lot of the folks that I serve with could be doing anything else and they choose to do this, so they like to do it. And so I know there's a lot of cynicism out there about elected officials and that sort of thing, but I tend to think that your state folks who you're more likely to run into at Starbucks than see as a talking head on the news is probably somewhat more engaged in the community and the specific schools and the things that you want to be talking about and asking about. And I would just encourage you to continue to develop a relationship with all of them. You might be surprised that some of them might be really interested in this, even if they didn't come from that background, and really want to engage and get involved.
Sharon, I just wanted to like lift that right back up, like what Jason said about relationship building. His anecdotes are so good. You know, between our different worlds, you know, we speak different languages in a way about the same problems and the same questions that need to be asked. And I think that bridging just the way that we talk about, you know, our ideas, that's one of the reasons why actually spending the time to develop a relationship and have that trust, and also like to, so California, and also to really have quality communication. It takes time, even for people who have really similar backgrounds, you know, come from the same place or have similar education levels or something like that. It's what he's saying is so true, like taking the time to meet up for coffee, even if it means that you're reaching fewer legislators or reaching fewer policymakers, probably is going to be more helpful, because then, you know, like I have my whole team and I have people I collaborate with across the department and in other agencies across the state, and they already, you know, have some trust with me because we've already worked together to support each other's projects. So it's so much about like communication efficiencies I have found in my ability to be helpful and to do work that means something.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Well, it looks like we've managed to fill up the time, not surprisingly, with two wonderful panelists. I just want to thank Tara and Jason so much for your time today. I know time is so valuable for all of us, so it was really a pleasure to listen and to get some wonderful insights from you. And I hope we can stay in touch, you know, over time as we develop our work in this area and, you know, work on these things, which my takeaways are, you know, the communication, transparency, relationship building really seem to be core pieces of this, in addition to doing good research, of course, which is our job to do. So I just want to thank you again, and remind folks that we did, our third panelist did provide a video and a paper summary of responses to these that will be made available to all registrants. I don't know if there's something else I need to share about that, Wade, regarding how people will get it. Tara and Jason, thank you for sharing your emails with the community as well, and being able to reach out to you. And I guess with that, we'll bid everyone adieu and enjoy what's left of the summer. And I really just thank you again both for everything.